Hello again. You're on Office Hours with the Mad Professor. I'm Liam. Today I'd like to discuss the distinction between nationalism and patriotism, since the terms are frequently conflated and used interchangeably within our society. To do that, I'll also deal with the distinctions between nations, states, and countries, also terms used interchangeably that should not be. And I'll do this by first discussing the difference between nationalism and patriotism. Then I will discuss the definitions of a few words that help us to understand the distinction between them. And I'll conclude with a historical sketch of the development of nationalism as an ideal or ideology and its relation to the nation-state project, and hopefully that makes the whole thing make a certain amount of sense. All right, so why am I recording this video? Well, first off, it came up in a conversation this morning. Second, this shows up frequently in discussions that I have with people who claim to be a nationalist and then are surprised when people are upset by that or find it somehow problematic, because then the person feeling challenged thinks that, well, what, do you hate your country? I just like my country, and I think other people should. I don't see the problem with liking my country. Well, they're not related terms. So, and finally, nationalism is actually an academic interest of mine, as you can see by the row of books on nationalist movements, so and nationalism as a concept. So, let's start with taking apart the word. Well, nationalism is not an extreme form of patriotism, and not really a form of patriotism at all. Patriotism is devotion to one's country. It's always been devotion to one's country. Patriotism has been around for a very long time. We can see patriotism amongst the Romans. I mean, loving your country is patriotism. Now, patriotism can be mild or it can be extreme. So, for example, nationalism is not an extreme form of patriotism as it's often described. Patriotism, again, devotion to one's country. I'll come back and define the term country in a bit. Nationalism is devotion to one's nation. Right? So the distinction between nation and country will be important here. Nationalism is almost always, to some degree, chauvinistic, but it can also be mild or extreme. It varies a bit too. So the spectrum between moderates and extreme or radical positions exists for both patriotism and nationalism, but they're actually separate terms and ideas, so it's a different spectrum entirely. So we need some further definitions here. Because at its core, nationalism is a political project about getting nation states for nations, about getting countries, independent countries for nations. Its origins are as a political project, and having achieved the independence of a nation state, it then pushes the interests of that nation. So the definitions are actually quite fundamental to understanding this, so even if this gets a little technical, please bear with me. First off, I use the word chauvinism, so let's make sure we understand that. Chauvinism is an extreme devotion to something that actually denigrates other people. So if you, for example, like the Pittsburgh Steelers, and you're a fan, okay, so you enjoy your team, but you can also cheer for other teams, and you can enjoy your team without necessarily hating the other team. If, for example, you instead cover yourself up in makeup to match the colors of the team, and you hurl insults and beer cans at the other team, and you put down every other possible team, the Vikings suck, really into your particular team, then you're a chauvinist, right? It is inherently more extreme. So that'll help a bit here, since nationalist movements do tend to be chauvinistic by definition. So first off, let's start taking apart these different terms. A nation is a distinct group of people. Peoples with a common identity. It refers to people, not countries. Nations are groups of people with a shared history, a common language, often a single ethnic identity, a shared or common culture. It doesn't have to have all of the different features here, but it does have to have most of them. And again, it refers specifically to the people. States are governing institutions, the political side of that. All right, so it's the institutions of government, like legislative, executive, different departments and ministries of government. It refers to borders. It refers to policing and the military. It refers to law. Right, so state is all these technical things that make a country possible. So, what is a country? A country is a state with defined physical territory. Right, which means people are patriotic towards their country and to some extent towards their state. The terms slightly overlap, but country brings in that sense of physical territory, which helps to make a lot more sense. It helps to clarify the actual object in question here. So a civic patriotism is then a devotion to one's country, right? Whereas a nationalism is going to be devotion to one's nation, to the people, separate from that. Now, those loyalties can overlap. Nationalists are often also devoted to their country. And this is because in the modern nation-state model, the two frequently are connected. The country is a country for a particular nation. All right, this is not always the case, and many countries are inherently diverse. This is true of immigrant nations. It's also true of a whole lot of countries that came together with tons of existing nationalities or different peoples already in that territory. So it doesn't necessarily have to be, but it can overlap between them. But you can also see nationalist movements specifically against the state. You can see this, for example, in the kind of people who say maybe support often racist militias in the U.S., stockpile weapons, talk about how they hate the government. Well, that's not patriotism at all. If they're attacking the government and they stockpile weapons against the government, they are not patriots, but they are nationalists. You can also see that, for example, in the Israeli settler movement in the West Bank. Many of the people there are devoted to the idea of a Jewish nation or Jewish nationalism, but actually oppose the authority of the state, which frequently tells them where they can or cannot live or might interfere with them. Many of these Jewish nationalists in the West Bank actually attack their own government and their own military. All right, as I said, I was going to conclude with a short historical sketch. Where does the term nationalism come from? How does it relate to the nation-state? What the whole point of this is. You can see the earliest origins of the nation-state in the circumstances surrounding the Protestant Reformation with the wars of religion in Europe. There were people arguing that some other alternative was necessary because of the religious passions that drove people to kill just so much of the population of Europe. The German wars of religion were extremely brutal. So trying to cultivate a sort of civic identity, an identity to a political model instead of a religious model. But not yet nationalist. Nationalism itself has its origins specifically at the end of the 18th century. And there are some people who put the American War of Independence at its origins and other people who put the French Revolution. I tend to think of the French Revolution as much more fundamentally nationalist than the United States, but there is a good case for both of them as the origins. The idea is in the air, so to speak. And it involves identifying a specific, homogeneous core population with a common shared history, culture, etc. there, and holding that up as the object of devotion. But there is still a connection here between the nations, the peoples living there, and the state, the idea of a government for them. The idea that in both of those cases they were overthrowing the existing regime and introducing a new one is one of the things that puts it sort of like at the foundations of the definition of modern nationalism, taking a people and arguing that they need their own government. But it's not yet quite this sort of chauvinistic nationalism that we can see developing all across the 19th century, from the early 19th century all the way through it into the early 20th century, and then from there it spreads into tons of other forms. Obviously nationalism has continued to be a significant force all the way through the Second World War in the Western world, and afterwards you develop all these post-colonial nationalisms, so which you can call sort of like, maybe third world nationalisms or anti-colonial or post-colonial nationalisms. So it's remained a salient point, an important political ideology. Nationalism being the idea that nations deserve a state. What you have in the idea of the nation state is where they come together. A country, a state, for a nation. You can see this in the breakdown of the major, multi-confessional and polyglot empires of Central and Eastern Europe. Look at the way that Austria-Hungary tore itself apart, and look at the different movements for secession in the Ottoman Empire and in the Russian Empire that saw these large empires that really did not have a common identity amongst the people, but simply had common governing institutions. And you can see how those governing institutions are no longer enough for the people's identity. They instead turn to the people who have things in common with them, to the nation. And they argue their distinct nation should have a state. Bulgarians need to be a separate country from other peoples, from Turks and from Greeks. Slovaks need to be separate from Czechs. This idea that because you speak a different language, you might have a different religion, you might have some differences in culture, you need to distinguish yourself from other people. That has remained a significant force throughout the world today. There are tons of nationalist movements that do exist within other extant countries. So, say, Catalan nationalism, or Scottish nationalism, or Balochi nationalism, or Kurdish nationalism. There's tons of movements here for separation that are based upon distinct national identities. So, again, your devotion to a nation is not the same as devotion to a country. A Catalan nationalist is a nationalist for Catalans, but not a patriot to Spain. Spain is the country, right? Spain is the nation state within which Catalans live. So Catalan nationalism is completely separate from it. When someone in the United States calls themselves a nationalist, this can be relatively innocuous. It could be a reference to that shared history that we have here in the United States since independence in the fight with the British. It could be a reference to common institutions like the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, certain ideals that make Americans, which means it can technically include diversity because the United States has always been an immigrant nation. But nationalist movements in the United States are often deeply chauvinistic, and references to them often specifically attack people with different national identities. So, for some people, nationalism would include both black and white Americans, Asian Americans, Native Americans, everybody into it. For other people, it does not. It favors the interests of the majority population. You also have references then to, say, language or common culture. So, being a nationalist in a white part of the United States may specifically exclude black Americans, it may specifically exclude Native Americans, it may specifically exclude Hispanic or Asian immigrants, which means it could be deeply racist, and often is. And that gets to the heart of why some people react badly to someone saying, I'm a nationalist. Nationalism has often been tied to atrocities, to ethnic cleansings, to genocides, everything from like the Armenian genocide and as well as the Greeks and everyone else that was killed during World War I by the Ottoman Empire, to the Nazi Holocaust. It's tied to things like the Indian Removal Act under Andrew Jackson. The idea that the nation has a specific definition, that's the problem there. It depends on how you define your nation. And in some places, this is very clear. Catalans speak a completely different language from the Spanish. and they have a specific tie to a particular chunk of territory that is only a part of the territory of Spain, so they can make no claim to the rest of it. So that's relatively easy to understand. Nationalist movements in the United States are much more complex, and you have to understand what someone means by their nation in order to understand whether it's a relatively innocuous form of nationalism or a quite pernicious one and a damaging one. Things like the white nationalist movements, for example, are explicitly racist. So I hope that this quick run through here of the definitions of the different terms of nation, state, and country, of nationalism and patriotism, I hope the definitions of those 5 terms have helped you in some way, as well as perhaps the historical sketch giving you some sense of like where it comes from and its relation to the different independence movements around the world for specific nations. If you like these videos, remember to hit the little button down here and subscribe, like the video, etc. Once again, this is Office Hours with the Mad Professor, and I'll see you next time.